John was born in Victoria. He spent much of his childhood in rural Australia, moving first, I understand, to Kyneton and then to Devonport in Tasmania. He taught for 9 years at Geelong Grammar and became head of English at the school's Timbertop campus. His first book, So Much to Tell You, was published in 1987. His landmark Tomorrow series is recognized as one of the most popular and important series books for young adults ever written in Australia. John's been very involved, and many of you would have heard about his school that's set up near Ramsey on his Thai estate property called Candlebark. This opened in 2006. It now has about 100 students, which range from prep to year 9, and I understand a waiting list of several hundred. John Marsden.
Well, thank you very much. And I wanted to talk a little more broadly tonight about language generally and its functions for us. I was very powerfully impressed years ago by a short story that I read a number of times, and it was called The Last Lesson, and I think it was set in Alsace-Lorraine at the time when Germany took that territory over, took that region over. And the story describes how a little boy is called in from his play to go to the afternoon lesson in the schoolhouse. And when he goes into the classroom, he finds that something quite odd is happening. All the dignitaries of the town are there, and they're all dressed in their Sunday best. And so the mayor is there, the deputy mayor, the baker, the pastry cook, all the substantial landholders of the region. And there's an air of solemnity and a hushed air of dignity and calm in the room, but a rather melancholy air. And the lesson, which is in French, just as we teach English in our schools, obviously in France, in French territories, French is taught, and this was a lesson on French, and the lesson proceeded, and gradually we, reading the story, and the little boy in the story, start to realise that the significance of this moment is that this is the last lesson that will be taught in French in the school, because the invaders have decreed that now German will be the official language of all educational institutions and that French can no longer be taught. And when one of the children has not done his homework satisfactorily, the teacher, who is also dressed in his Sunday best, exclaims sadly, "What an opportunity you have lost. You could have learned our beautiful language, and now this opportunity is passing you by." And the children, even though they're not quite aware of what's going on, do understand the solemnity of the occasion and the gravity of what is happening. And it is symptomatic of invasions that one of the things that is done by the invaders is to try to take over the languages of the people who have been conquered. In the north of Scandinavia, for example, Lap children who were forcibly sent to boarding schools were caned when they spoke their own language. And we are very aware of the similar situations in Australian schools and institutions where Aboriginal children were caned for using Aboriginal languages, because there is something about language which goes to the very soul of a country, and something about language which goes to the very soul of a people. And if you can capture a language and replace it with your own, then you have done something very powerful. The same thing, of course, works on an individual basis, where we, in colonising our children with our language, then colonise them in a much broader sense. And so by teaching them the language that we ourselves speak and write, and the various idioms of that language, and the patterns of that language, and the vocabularies that we use, we are doing something much more powerful than equipping them with language. We are taking them over and giving them our values, our culture, in a way which can be beneficial. There's nothing necessarily toxic about that. It's an inevitable process, it's an essential process, but when carried to excess, can be as damaging to an individual as it can be to a nation. I remember, for example, in a library in Melbourne a few years ago, signing some books at the end of a talk I'd given, and a young woman of about 17 approached me with her mother beside her, and as I signed the young woman's book, she told me how she herself wanted to be a writer, and I said, "Well, great, go for it." And she said, "Yes, I've just won a short story competition." And her mother chipped in and said, "Well, you didn't actually win, you came second." And the girl said, "Well, Mum, it was shared because the other girl was 26, so they ended up making us the joint winners, okay? And then the girl said to me, anyway, it was a story about an alien who comes to Earth, and the mother interrupted and said, well, it wasn't actually one alien, it was a whole group of aliens. And the girl said, well, that doesn't matter, I mean, it's irrelevant. And she said, anyway, it won the prize. It was the Ferntree Gully Library that had the competition, and her mother said, well, not actually the Ferntree Gully Library, it was the Hillsville Library. And the girl said, Mum, it was the two libraries combined, they had this regional competition, all right? And at that point I'd had enough, and I said to the woman, do you always do this? To the mother. And she said, what? And I said, do you stand there with a red pen marking everything that comes out of your daughter's mouth? And her daughter went, yes, at last. And the mother looked a little disconcerted, as you would, and said, do I really do that? And I said, well, all I can say is you've been doing it ever since we started this conversation. And I must say, to her credit, the mother took it very well, and when they left the library, she was engaged in quite an intense dialogue, it seemed, with her daughter, where they were both going at it in an amiable way, but I felt that it was an important conversation, perhaps, that they were having. But I did feel very strongly that there was a real danger to that young woman's development, that if the mother was to continue to do that, to continue to step into the daughter's mind, into her larynx or whatever, and replace the daughter's voice with her own, then the future of that young woman was imperiled. And a couple of years later, I was quite gratified to hear a talkback conversation, a talkback caller, ringing one of the football radio stations, ABC, I think, 774, and telling a story involving Kevin Sheedy. And this man described how he had taken his son, who was about 15, to a dinner where Kevin Sheedy was the guest speaker. And at the end of the dinner, the boy approached Kevin Sheedy with his father in tow and said to Sheedy, I love playing football. And Sheedy said, who do you play for? And the father said he plays for the Diamond Valley League. And Sheedy said to the boy, what position do you like best? And the father said, well, he likes anywhere in the forward line, but full forward in particular. And on radio, the man described how at that point Sheedy turned to him and said, do you mind? I'm having this conversation with your son, not with you. And the man, to his credit, said, I admired Kevin Sheedy before that dinner, but by God, I admired him a lot more after it, because he made me realise something that I should have been aware of much earlier, that I was too inclined to speak for my son and to take his voice away from him and replace it with my own, and that he is in fact perfectly capable of speaking for himself. So one of the most powerful things we can do, it therefore follows, is to give young people their own voice and to encourage them to use language in a way which truly represents their own feelings, their thoughts, their opinions, that will project a sense of themselves to others. And in doing that, we empower them in a meaningful way to take their place in the modern world. So what works on a macro level with nations and societies works too on a micro level with individuals. And I guess that's the single most important lesson that I've learned about language in my 57 years so far. Thank you.
Arnold is an award-winning writer, storyteller, educator, and human rights advocate. His books include Jewels and Ashes, which won 5 Australian Literary Awards and depicts his journey to Poland to trace his ancestry. Café Scheherazade depicts the lives of former refugees who meet in a coffee shop in a seaside suburb in Melbourne. The Fig Tree is a book of true stories set in Greece. His novel Scraps of Heaven is set in the post-war immigrant community of the Melbourne suburb Carlton. And his latest book, Sea of Many Returns, was published in June. Arnold's president of PEN Victoria and works actively in migrant communities throughout Victoria. Arnold Zable.
Thank you very much, and I'd like to acknowledge the Kulin people and the Wurundjeri on whose land we stand. Years ago, I discovered a great mystery that I'd grown up in the city and had 16 years of education, 12 years of schooling and 4 years doing an honours history, political science course, and I learnt many histories, but it was extraordinary that never once in all that time did I hear the name Wurundjeri or the name Bunurong, the people on the coast, and the Kulin nation of which the Wurundjeri and the Bunurong are both part. Isn't that extraordinary if you come to think of it? And I then did something about it, and I met Joy Murphy, one of the great elders of the Wurundjeri people, and we went on an amazing journey together over a number of years where she took me to their special places. And she taught me a lot about other ways of seeing things. And I wanted to begin with a story, a short story, because I think when we're looking at literacy, there's literacy and there's communication. And I want to explore this a little bit. And there's storytelling. And we sometimes forget that the oral storyteller, it's another great form of communication. And maybe really what I want to explore is, is there a way of getting all of this together? And if we do that, then we have a kind of respect for all kinds of ways of seeing things and expressing things. And this story goes back to my stay in China in 1984-85, when I spent a year there teaching English at an agricultural college in a remote province. It was one of the best years of my life. And I was the only Waigwaren, outside person, a foreigner, in this particular place. And this was in 84-85, and China was coming out of an extraordinarily difficult time when the country basically went mad. It was a kind of psychosis called the Cultural Revolution. So I was really welcomed with open arms, and every night I used to go for a walk in the small town that I was living in, and I'd end up on this bridge over a river called the Huaxi River. And in the middle of the bridge there was a watermill, and there was a guy in there who smoked a long stem pipe, and there was a pot-bellied stove. He'd make me a cup of tea, and he didn't speak a word of English, and I hardly spoke a word of Chinese, and you'd hear thum, thum, the sound of the water wheel going round and round, and farmers had come down from the countryside, and they'd bring their stuff to be ground into whatever. And I just loved just sitting there with him. And after about 9 months, I said to one of my students, they were all adults, and I said to Kanchi Chuan, I said, look, I want you to come with me. I want you to translate something. So we went to the watermill. I said, I want you to tell this guy that I want to say thank you for all the great times we've had here, because I'm leaving in a few weeks. And this guy said, via translation to me, he said, I want you to tell the Waigwaren, I want you to tell him that I want him to write a couplet, right? Now, this was something which was going to be translated into Chinese to be, you have a heading, it's a traditional form, where you have a heading over the door, and then you have one vertical line, the first line of the couplet, and another vertical line, the second line of the couplet. And he said, I want him, now listen very carefully to this. He says, I want the Waigwaren to write a couplet that sums up all the conversations we've had in the last 8-9 months. Now, isn't that absolutely extraordinary and beautiful? And I thought, now this guy really knows a thing or two. So I thought to myself, well, what can I write, right, that's meaningful? I had enough journals I'd written in that time to write a book about my stay in China, but two lines to sum it all up. And then it came to me. What I wrote was, the heading is Huaxi Watermill. And I wrote, I come from a distant place to Huaxi Watermill. Here I feel at peace, my mind becomes still. Now, as I was writing this, every word counts when it's just a couplet. I was thinking, what should I write? My mind becomes still, or my heart becomes still? In the end, I settled for mind. But when they translated it into the Chinese, when Kanchi Chuan wrote it out in Chinese, the character for heart and mind, the Chinese character, was the same. And I guess that's the moment I love most of all, when you cross a cultural boundary and you discover, and I've had many moments like this, you discover two things in that moment. What you discover is that we're all different, and each language is unique. And as John put it in his talk, the heart and soul of a people can be found in its language. There are different ways of seeing things, and we need them all. It's part of our great treasure of humankind, our great diversity. But at the same time, you also discover our common humanity. These are the two things that come together in great stories, when people share their stories. And when it comes to the issue of literacy for me, I grew up with two languages, and they were like two strands of the same rope. They were intertwined. I don't know which language came first, Yiddish or English. Maybe it was Yiddish actually, because my mum used to sing Yiddish lullabies and Yiddish songs. So I had these two different ways of seeing things. When you spoke the Yiddish language, you felt differently. Even today, when I speak that language, I feel different. It's a lovely feeling. It's a feeling of great warmth and a feeling of belonging to something very special. And I'm sure it's like this with Aboriginal languages and all languages, that people they enter into a kind of a community that has got a vast tradition going back many, many years, that kind of unites people in certain ways that are very, very deep, almost unfathomable. When I think about my earliest reading of books, I was very, very fortunate to learn both languages, and each one has a different alphabet. So when you're reading the Yiddish, it's actually the Hebrew alphabet. And there's something magical about those letters. My father was a Yiddish poet. English was his sixth language. And he was kind of illiterate, in a sense, all over again when he came to Australia, which is another thing which interests me, how immigrants are often infantilized when they come to a new country, because they've got, they speak in a way that people look down at them because they can't speak that language properly, and they've got to learn anew to communicate. And often that's mistaken for being backward. Whereas in reality, in my parents' case, they knew 5 other languages. And my father was a Yiddish poet, but of course here, to a large extent, he'd lost his audience. And one of my most precious memories of going to this little cottage in Lygon Street, next door to what is now Aeolian Hall, which was once the Kadima, which was the community centre for for secular Jews. And it was like we had Yiddish theatre there, and it had a community functions there, and they had a beautiful library. It was a travelling library, a multilingual library, which had begun in 1911 in Burke Street, and then it shifted to 313 Drummond Street in 1915, and then it came to this building, which the community built in 1933 and was housed in a little cottage next door to it, and now it's in Elsternwick. In 1968, the community centre shifted to the other side of the Yarra. And I'd go into this little cottage to borrow a book, a Yiddish book, and you'd see these guys bent over those books as if they were at prayer, studying sacred texts. And that love of the written word is so connected in my memory with going there on a winter's night to get another Yiddish book. And so reading for me involved 2 languages, but it also always involved storytelling. And it always involved my parents sitting in the kitchen with their old world friends, sharing stories. And they'd be talking about distant landscapes, Bialystok, Bryansk, Grodek, Orly. These were villages on the Russian-Polish border where my ancestors came from. And this landscape was described in those Yiddish books that I read. And so it gave me another dimension. I was eternally grateful for that. And so I think as a writer, when I became a writer, this became very central to what I was doing. It became central in ways that expressed themselves in my work. For example, when I wrote Cafe Scheherazade, if you read that, it's actually written in a kind of Yiddish syntax. I was playing around, I was saying, this is the way these guys speak in this kind of, they enter the cafe, how are you going? How am I going? I'm lucky to be alive. And how's your business? My business is deep in the ground. And how are your children? My children, they're so busy, I have to make an appointment to see them, right? This is the way they banter and they talk. And I wanted to capture that. And I wanted to give that voice that John was speaking about, that was uniquely theirs, the voice that you can see in Alexis's Carpentaria, that unique voice that makes it a very, very special work of literature, something unique. And so I did it again. I've done it in many, many projects. And now that I've written this novel that's set mainly in Greece, and it's based on my wife's family's journeys from the island of Ithaca, I've done the same there, where I've brought in language. I've brought in Greek language at certain points. You've got to do it in a delicate way, a way that works in with the manuscript. And I want to end up by just making a couple of observations. It seems to me that if we're looking at this issue of literacy, and if we're looking at the issue of working with different communities. In my case, I worked for many years with migrants and refugees. And what I saw again and again and again, that if you're working with these communities, if you want to learn a new language quickly, if you want to become literate in a new alphabet or whatever, you have to respect the people who are doing the learning. And you have to realise that really the way people learn quickly is if what they're learning about and what they're discussing is of relevance to them. This is what it comes down to. Is it of relevance to them? There's a great Brazilian pedagogue called Paulo Freire who wrote a book called The Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And I think it was Brazil that he worked in. And he worked in some of the very poor neighbourhoods teaching literacy. And he discovered very early on that the textbooks that they used to have were totally irrelevant to them. And so he had to recreate the textbooks and get into the slang and the language of the streets, of the favolas, I think they were called. And so this is very, very important. It's something that I've discovered over and over and over again, that you've got to respect the people that you're working with if it's going to actually work. Because what it comes down to, and I think all of us have said this one way or the other, what it actually comes down to is empowerment. Learning to read and write is all about empowerment. And it comes back also to the first point I made, which is that in the end, there is this wonderful paradox, or two sides to the same coin, and that is we are all unique. As individuals, we are unique. As different nationalities that have come to this country, we bring our unique languages and our culture and our traditions, and this is all. That's what we've got to contribute. This is what is making this a more diverse, multilingual society. It's enriching the English language by being transfused by all these other languages. And at the same time, hopefully, through sharing our stories and bringing them to light, and reading each other's stories, we discover our common humanity. Thank you very much.